Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today with us. We're joined today by guests and viewers from across the country and around the world. I am joining from the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. This is a particularly heavy acknowledgement this week as we collectively mourn the loss of 215 children found at a mass grave at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. We wanted to start this morning with a brief moment of silence in recognition of that. Okay, thank you. We will be getting started in just a moment. A quick reminder about interpretation. The presentations today will be in English and in French. There is simultaneous interpretation. You just need to click on the globe symbol at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select the language that you need. For those of you on Facebook Live, please enjoy this bilingual presentation. Please use the chat function if you are in need of assistance. Nous commencerons sous peu. Les interventions auront lieu en français et en anglais aujourd'hui. Il y a de l'interprétation en français au besoin. On n'a qu'à cliquer sur le bouton globe au bas de l'écran.
We will begin shortly. Presentations will be in French and English today. French interpretation is available if needed. Just click on the little globe at the bottom of the screen and select the desired language. For technical support, please write in the chat.
On Facebook Live. For those of us joining on Zoom today, you can put your questions directly into the Q&A box or into the chat box where they will be collected. If you'd like to ask a question live, you can use the raise hand feature and we'll open up your channel so you can ask the question. For those on Facebook, you can write questions in the chat there and they will be sent to us here. So thank you again for being with us today. My name is Evelyne Dwyer. I'm the National Coordinator of the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability. We're very pleased to have with us today, on behalf of our 39 member organizations and their global partners around the world, to announce the release of new model legislation. Kalpona Akter from the Bangladesh Center for Worker Solidarity, Evelyne Beaudoin from Development and Peace, Caritas Canada, Ken Newman from the United Steelworkers, Karen Hamilton from Above Ground, and Kedi Nivyabandi from Amnesty International Canada. So first, we have the great privilege of hearing from Kalpona Akter from the Bangladesh Center for Worker Solidarity. Thank you, Kalpona.
Thank you so much for having me here. I know it is really a great moment for all of us who are in the call. The importance of due diligence law that I wanted to say from the ground, it is so important for the workers who are down to the chain. The companies, especially, they are not, at this moment, they are not obligated to anyone. So if these companies can be obligated, can be reported to the authority, that will ensure that workers in the down to the supply chain are not dying. Many of you know Rana Plaza, a factory which has collapsed a few years ago with thousands of workers. If the companies in Canada would already been obligated during that time, we would be not facing this catastrophe in here, which is absolutely preventable. All the voluntary document, all the voluntary activism that the companies do, that doesn't help people in the ground. So a due diligence law with human rights, worker rights, and climate obligation will really help the people in the supply chain and especially people in the ground in here. Thank you.
Merci, Kalpona. Maintenant, j'ai le plaisir de vous présenter Evelyne Beaudoin, la présidente de Développement et Paix, Caritas Canada. Evelyne?
Merci, Emily, et bonjour à tous. Aujourd'hui est un jour marquant pour nous à Développement et Paix, Caritas Canada. car cette législation modèle sur la diligence raisonnable en matière de droits humains et d'environnement répond à un besoin que nous reconnaissons comme urgent. Le statu quo et les règles volontaires n'ont apporté aucun succès. Cette nouvelle législation changerait la donne. L'approche actuelle du Canada consiste à conseiller les entreprises, à les encourager à s'asseoir à la table des négociations avec les personnes concernées ou à exiger des entreprises qu'elles rendent compte de mesures prises. L'Ombudsman canadien pour la responsabilité des entreprises, l'OCRE, a le pouvoir de publier des rapports, mais il est impuissant à obtenir les faits et n'a encore résolu aucune plainte. Ce nouveau modèle de loi cherche à obliger les entreprises à respecter les droits humains et à prendre des mesures pour identifier, atténuer, prévenir et traiter les violations des droits humains dans les activités des entreprises ainsi que dans les chaînes d'approvisionnement mondiales. Nos partenaires du Sud nous parlent de situations alarmantes allant de priver les paysans de leurs sources d'eau potable, de détruire les arbres qui sont leur gagne-pain depuis plusieurs générations, de faire disparaître ou même assassiner ceux qui revendiquent leurs droits fondamentaux. Le Canada doit passer à une approche axée sur la prévention des dommages et donnant la priorité aux droits des communautés touchées. Nombreux sont les témoignages tels celui de Kalpona, qui reflètent la dure réalité de ces communautés. Il est possible pour les compagnies de réaliser des profits tout en respectant les modalités de cette loi, mais jamais le profit des entreprises ne doit se faire au détriment des personnes et de l'environnement. Heureux le jour où les entreprises canadiennes qui profitent des abus sans en subir les conséquences sera chose du passé et où il y a eu transfert et partage du pouvoir envers et pour les communautés affectées et leurs soucis de l'environnement. Merci.
Thank you, Evelyne. Now we will hear from Ken Newman, the National Director for Canada of the United Steelworkers. Ken?
Thank you, Emily. The steelworkers share Kalpona's and Evelyne's views on why this model legislation we are proposing today is urgently needed. Legislation like this will be good for workers and good for business. Our proposed legislation is balanced, reasonable, and in line with legislation proposed in European countries. Canadian companies know that they are expected to respect workers and human rights no matter where or how they operate. In the last decade, the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights have clearly set out companies' global responsibilities. The Government of Canada itself says that it expects our companies to respect rights. None of that is new. Our legislation moves respect for workers, respect for rights from expectation to a clear legal requirement based on Canadian law. It enables workers and communities to sue in Canadian courts where they've been harmed. Canadian businesses that understand the importance of protecting human and environmental rights in all of their global activities and will welcome legislation that clearly defines their responsibilities and accountability. We have learned this from the European companies that do not like uncertainty, but they will accept legislation that provides clarity and applies constantly to all of their competitors. Respect for the environment and human rights is becoming more and more important for companies in consumer and capital markets. Automobile companies concerned about growing consumer awareness of rights issues are looking at the social performance of their suppliers, steel companies, and beyond them of mining companies that supply their materials. Likewise, there's a growing preference from institutional investors for companies that focus on environmental and human rights. In that context, Canadian legislation that requires companies to requiring companies to proactively address environment and human rights impacts can position Canadian businesses for success in the future. The Steelworkers Union and the broader labor movement fully support this model legislation.
Thank you very much for those remarks, Ken. Now we will hear from Karen Hamilton, Interim Director of Above Ground. Karen?
Thank you, Emily, and hello, everyone. In today's global economy, companies operate in diverse geographic locations and in highly complex business relationships and supply chains. Yet, as others have mentioned, Canada lacks effective safeguards to ensure that in this context, businesses aren't profiting from human rights abuse and environmental harm. The model legislation would change that. The Corporate Respect for Human Rights in the Environment Abroad Act is the product of engagement in Canada and with international partners and allies. It's backed by 150 organizations and unions across the globe and by organizations from various sectors in Canada, including those represented here today. The model law is also the product of extensive research and is informed by best practice. It draws on an existing French law and on similar proposals being considered in parliaments across Europe. The model has three key elements. The first element is the corporate duty to prevent harm. The model law would create an obligation for companies, including companies headquartered in Canada or selling goods in Canada, to prevent human rights abuse and environmental harm across their global operations, including in their supply chains. The second element is the corporate duty to conduct adequate due diligence. The model law would require companies to develop and implement adequate human rights and environmental due diligence procedures in consultation with rights holders and to report on these procedures annually. The third element is access to remedy. The model law would establish a meaningful consequence, liability, in cases where companies cause harm or fail to conduct adequate due diligence. This means that people who are harmed by a company's operations abroad would have the statutory right to file a civil suit against the company in a Canadian court to seek remedy for the harms suffered. Companies would have a defense if they could establish they'd conducted effective due diligence to prevent the harm. Above Ground shares the opinion of other speakers here that Canada has fallen behind on corporate accountability. The Corporate Respect for Human Rights in the Environment Abroad Act provides the Canadian government with a blueprint for catching up to global leaders in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those interventions, Karen. And now last, but certainly not least, we will hear from Ketty Nivyabandi from Amnesty International Canada. Ketty?
Thank you, Emily. First, let me say that Canada's failure to regulate and to ensure access to remedy for harms which are due to Canadian business activity overseas is inconsistent with Canada's international human rights obligations. Indeed, several UN bodies have called out Canada for its lack of oversight of businesses and have urged the government to hold companies accountable for their operations overseas and to adopt measures to prevent multiple human rights violations. Secondly, Canada, as others have mentioned, is falling behind global trends. Other countries, such as France, for instance, are currently implementing or are moving towards passing comprehensive legislation, while Canada only focuses so far on voluntary guidelines and reporting-only approaches. This legislation that is proposed is a draft. It will need to be updated to keep pace with the emerging best practice. Currently, several laws are being debated in Parliament and at the European Commission to really develop a very comprehensive legislation for the entire region. So it's time for Canada to catch up with those trends. Thirdly, Canadians want Canada to build better after the pandemic. The Canadian government and business need to take a people-centered and human rights-centered approach and prioritize that over economic growth and recovery. And we think that this legislation will help. Indeed, as the UN Human Rights Commissioner has said, mandatory human rights due diligence is a tool on the global efforts to build back better. We strongly encourage members of parliament from all parties to respond to this call and to advance and support this legislation to help impacted communities be able to access remedy if and when they are harmed. it is encouraging that parliaments from several parties have, particularly at the subcommittee on international human rights, have already called on Canada to implement such legislation, but for a specific region, in this case, it's Xinjiang in China. However, this cannot be done on a single case or a single country basis. So it is past time for Canada to act. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ketty, and to all of our speakers today. We will now be opening it up to questions from journalists. For those of us joining us on Zoom, you can put your questions directly into the Q&A function or the chat. If you'd like to ask a question live, you can use the raise hand feature and we'll open up your channel so you can ask the question live. For those of you who are watching on Facebook, you can write questions into the chat and they will be sent to us over here. Jean Sims, do we have any questions yet?
Yes, I have no questions on the Q&A or on the chat as of right now. I will be speaking in English so as not to confuse the simultaneous interpretation, but you may pose your question in English or in French, and just make sure that you're on the correct channel for interpretation in the language of your choice. Peter Mazzaro would like to pose a question now. We're opening your channel. One moment.
Oh, okay. I think.
Yep, you're on.
You can hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So I'm interested in why you decided to release draft legislation right now when Parliament is overloaded with legislation, about to sort of wind up for the summer, and there's a lot of speculation that they're not going to be coming back before an election. I think the odds, it's fair to say, of them passing this legislation in this Parliament are pretty slim. Why do it now?
Emily, would you like to take that question?
Sure, thank you. Hi, Peter. It's a very good question. And part of the reason that we are launching this legislation at this time is because it's really important for public and parliamentary dialogue at this moment to be focused on a comprehensive law that can respond adequately to the abuses. What we are seeing in Parliament at the moment are discussions around laws that really would bring Canada to the back of the international pack in responding to corporate accountability. So, for example, laws that are focused on reporting or on a specific right like modern slavery, which doesn't keep up with international best practice and doesn't actually, the evidence shows, doesn't actually respond to corporate abuse. We think that it is urgent for Canada to take action now. We are under no illusions that this law will be passed in the current Parliament, but think that it is important to have a public discussion and debate around it at this time. Others on the panel can also jump in to answer that if you'd like to more fully.
Maybe just as a follow-up then, we know that this current government has gone through this process of dealing with the requests for a ombudsperson for corporate responsibility, and they promised to create this office to tackle some of these same problems, and they broke their promise to make it an independent and empowered office. So clearly there's not currently a lot of will in government to tackle this problem. How do you get around that and find champions for this in government?
Yeah, what the CNCA is calling for is both an empowered ombudsperson with independent investigatory powers, and as a complement to that, due diligence legislation that would require companies to prevent harm, to undertake due diligence, and that would provide access to Canadian courts so that people can access justice and remedy. One of the things that's distinct between our campaign for an ombudsperson office and the campaign for mandatory human rights due diligence legislation is that with the Ombudsperson's office, we were calling for Canada to be a global leader, to be the first country of the world to create an office of this kind. They originally responded to that call in 2018 and then backtracked. Where it's slightly different in the realm of mandatory human rights due diligence legislation is that we're actually not calling on Canada to be a global leader or a global first. We're calling on them to catch up to the global momentum that's happening around the world. European countries are passing or debating and bringing in this kind of legislation, and Canadian companies and the Canadian economy will be falling behind if they don't start to catch up soon. I should also mention that there are champions throughout Canadian Parliament who are in support of this legislation, and we intend to try and expand the number of supporters both within and outside of Parliament, and we think that this legislation will help to do so.
Emily, if I may, it's Ken Nolan from the Steelworkers, and Peter, thank you for the question. And further to what Emily said, that no, we don't see us getting the legislation because the House is coming near its end. But look, there's no reason why a political will and make this an election campaign, as Emily had said that, or you had said that in your question, is that they'd made an announcement that they're going to bring in the ombudsperson with kind of the powers that we were looking at. And the fact is that they have not lived up to that promise. And as the steelworkers, we represent a lot of the major mining companies in this country. And the fact is that we often get calls from other countries such as Mexico, of where Canadian companies are there, not living up to the environmental standards or the community and whatnot. So the Canadian government has to do the right thing to make sure that that these abuses are stopped and that we're all on the same level playing field. There's an example out there of Europeans that have brought in that legislation. So as others have said, that look, it's time for Canada to catch up and do the right thing, because this is good for workers and it's also good for business. And there's nothing worse than having your reputation soiled by some companies that aren't prepared to live up to the human rights.
Ken, maybe I could just ask you quickly, why has your union decided to get involved with this? I mean, why does the average Canadian steel worker care about this issue?
Well, we represent a lot of, Peter, we represent a lot of global companies around, we're an international union. The fact is that we represent a lot of mining and other sectors. And the fact is that we've seen it firsthand. I mean, we have a very close association with our NAFTA partner in Mexico, where a lot of Canadian mining companies are there. We've seen the devastation. We've worked with the Los Mineros as a union, and we understand of how they've not lived up to workers' rights. They've not lived up to the trade union movement rights. So it's important for our union. I mean, the steelworkers stand for decency and respect. It's no different than the workers in Bangladesh. They should be able to go to work in the morning with a health and safety environment and be able to come home to their loved ones. And why would Canada not want that? Why would we not want a standard around the globe that lifts the boats for everyone? And the fact is that this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for the government of Canada to send a very clear message that you're going to live up to these particular rights. It's kind of like having a speeding, having a law says that you got a speed limit, but you got no one there to enforce it. That's similar to this.
Bonjour, Peter. Et si je peux ajouter, Développement et Paix est là depuis 2006 à travailler sur ce même dossier. C'est un dossier qui nécessite un temps pour l'éducation des gens à travers le Canada. Et nous, Développement et Paix, Caritas Canada, avec nos plus de 10 000 membres, dans le passé, on a travaillé à éduquer nos députés à Ottawa. Et c'est ce qu'on projette faire prochainement. Et pour faire cette éducation-là, il faut commencer tôt à préparer les outils, à préparer les rendez-vous et au moment propice de rencontrer ces députés-là pour avoir une discussion franche sur ce que le Canada entend faire pour se rattraper dans ces lois qui protègent. Puis il n'est jamais trop tôt pour parler d'abus et pour parler de destruction de l'environnement. Je crois que c'est temps. Merci.
Mm-hmm. And Peter, if I may add also that it goes beyond reputation. It's also a question of obligations for Canada. So as mentioned earlier, the lack, the inconsistency with Canada's international obligations on this issue has actually attracted the attention of several UN international treaty body monitoring bodies, such as the CEDAW, for instance, which is a committee on the elimination of discrimination against women, the International Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the UN Human Rights Committee, the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, for instance, which points out to activities that negatively impact on the enjoyment of rights of Indigenous peoples outside Canada, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So it very much is an issue of honoring its international human rights obligations, beyond what Emily was mentioning earlier, which was calling it to be a leader and going ahead by the creation of the ombudsperson with investigative powers. So it really is a question of Canada honoring its current international human rights obligations.
I see there are a couple other questions in the queue, so maybe I'll just ask one more quickly. I heard Rana Plaza being discussed earlier in this. Could you give me an example of how, if this law was in place now, a situation like that could have been prevented, where you have Canadian companies using subcontractors in another country? They don't know what the subcontractors are doing exactly, and how would this kind of a law prevent that from happening?
Yeah, I can start with, and of course, the rest of the panelists can add with that. Thanks, Peter. So, at this moment, or when Rana Plaza has happened, it is true that brand would be not known that where is their companies are, or where their factories are who are producing for them. Maybe they will be not go into the subcontract factories. But I think this law required the companies to report to the appropriate commissioner or appropriate authority that where their goods are producing and in what condition. And the people in the supply chain will have a right to go to the native country of these companies and make the brands obligated. So that is, that will help us to prevent a future kind of homicide that we have been faced in Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, or Ali Enterprise in Pakistan, or any accident that recently we faced in Egypt or in Morocco. So I know that many of the panel, everyone says that no one asking Canada to be a leader for this law. They're just asking, we all are asking Canada to join with the good thing that other countries are doing for their supply chain people.
Thank you, Kalpona. Any other member of the panel would like to respond? Compliment that, Emily, go ahead.
Thank you for that response, Kalpona, and for your question, Peter. I mean, I think one of the things to highlight is that this legislation responds exactly to that kind of situation, where it's a recognition that the way that companies operate is through complex global supply chains and relationships. The obligations created in here, the obligation to prevent and avoid human rights abuse and environmental damage, the obligation to do due diligence, is not just about the Canadian company itself, but extends through their supply chains and business relationships, which means that this kind of willful blindness that you're talking about, of saying you don't know who you're sourcing from, is something that would not be allowed to continue to happen. You can't outsource your responsibility to respect human rights.
Thank you. I'll just note that Ken Newman had to leave for another meeting, but we'll continue here for the questions. I do have a couple of questions from Facebook Live. Stephanie Taddy Stringer asks, how does this legislation hold corporations responsible for the actions of subsidiaries or subcontracted companies? You were speaking about that just now, but maybe you could just add a little bit more for that, either Emily, Kalpona, or other people.
I can start. The legislation creates an obligation for companies to prevent and avoid serious human rights impacts, not only those that are directly attributed to their own actions, but also that are caused by their affiliates or business relationships when it's linked to those operations. So there's an obligation to prevent and avoid human rights that flows throughout the supply chains. Similarly, the due diligence obligation flows throughout your supply chains and global operations. The way that those obligations are enforced, those kinds of obligations have been there's been an expectation for companies to be doing this for quite a long time. Both the Canadian government and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights have indicated that companies have a responsibility to respect human rights throughout their supply chains and to do due diligence. So that what we're doing here is making that a legal obligation. It's not creating a new obligation or expectation. But the enforcement of that obligation is something that is new. There are two ways that would be done through the legislation. One is by creating a commissioner that would be able to enforce the responsibility to report. And second is through facilitating access to Canadian courts, establishing a statutory right to bring civil suits in Canada, vis-a-vis if companies have caused harm, or if companies have failed to conduct and implement effective due diligence.
Thank you. Emily, just if you could say, how is that regarding the statutory right, how is that different from now? People are already, there are some cases in Canadian courts against Canadian companies' operations overseas. Could you sort of specify how that's different now under this legislation?
There have recently been some really important developments in the Canadian legal system that have gone through to the Supreme Court of Canada. It's now no longer a question that that Canadian companies operating overseas can be sued in Canadian courts. However, it is still, there remain several barriers to accessing Canadian courts, and even those cases took years and years to get to where they are today. There can continue to be arguments around whether Canada is the appropriate jurisdiction, what the standard and duty of care that companies owe to people and the environment in their operations throughout their supply chains. So this legislation provides a statutory right, so you're not relying on common law principles, but it's outlined in legislation to clarify companies' responsibilities and the standard that they need to be operating and held to around the world.
Thus doing away for about 7 years of litigation before you even get to the merits of the case. So thank you for that. We have from Jeff Dillon this question. He's been following the proposed rules in the EU, and his understanding of them is that it covers the supply chains of European companies, but he didn't think that it covered the actions of the European companies themselves while operating abroad. Is he correct in this understanding of the proposed EU rules? And he asks, if so, would this confirm that you're seeking a more comprehensive regulation than the EU with your draft legislation? Emily, I think that's yours.
The international models are constantly evolving at the European Commission as well. My understanding of the latest models is that it covers both those companies and their supply chains, etc. But I would have to look to see if that has changed. That's certainly the case for the French duty of vigilance legislation, where it is liability can be attached to both companies and their affiliates. I am not certain whether, given that the European model is looking at an entire region rather than a national piece of legislation, it is possible that that it is being written in a way to coincide with the developments of national legislation there. But my understanding is that it would cover both European companies and their supply chains, and that our model is quite consistent with international best practice at the moment.
Mhm. Would any other panelists like to comment on that? Okay, seeing none. Stephanie Taddy Stringer asks, what do you see as the potential environmental benefits of this legislation? Evelyne?
Oui, si je peux. Dans plusieurs des instances où on a eu connaissance d'abus des droits humains, souvent, il y a un lien avec l'environnement. Par exemple, si on regarde en Amazonie tout récemment, si on regarde le développement de l'agriculture dans certains pays du Sud, il y a souvent, si pas toujours ou presque toujours, un lien avec l'environnement. Et de nos jours, on reconnaît scientifiquement et de bien d'autres façons aussi, on le voit avec nos yeux, la détérioration de nos océans et de l'environnement. Alors, je crois que c'est difficile de séparer les droits humains à ce moment ici de l'environnement parce que c'est tout lié, c'est notre maison commune selon Laudato Si. Et le pape François, et je crois que c'est très, très fort comme concept de toujours lier les deux ensemble. Merci.
Thank you. I do have another question in French. Interpreter, should I switch to the French channel when I read it? I think Evelyne has partially answered it at least, but should I switch to French channel? No? Okay, thank you. This is de Pascal André Charles-Bois. Que signifie le mot environnement dans le titre de la loi? Environnement, milieu de travail ou environnement dans le sens de nature?
L'environnement dans le titre du loi signifie l'environnement nature. Donc, dans la loi modèle, on indique clairement que les droits humains, ça comprend aussi le droit à un environnement sain et durable. Donc, la loi prévoit que les compagnies devraient respecter les droits de la personne, ce qui comprend les droits à un environnement sain et durable.
Thank you. Okay, Kalpona, would you like to complement that regarding the environmental effects of this law?
Yes, I do. I wanted to basically address two things. One, definitely the environment. To including the environmental piece in the due diligence law, how important it is, you can only understand if you visit one of our country which we call production countries. Like, to making one piece of t-shirt, it needs to use 14 liters of waters, one t-shirt. Just think about a pair of jeans. So we already, in Bangladesh, we already used, next 200 years of waters, which our next generation is supposed to be using, that we already have been used just to produce the clothes. Just think about other industry that we produce for. So it is so important to bring the environmental issue under this due diligence law. the companies who are producing down to the supply chain, the supplier shouldn't be throw all the waste in the river, in the field, which is totally killing our wildlife, which is making our waters unusable. And you cannot believe the crisis that we have been facing during summer or whatever the time, to drinking water, to to get water for shower and etc. So bringing the companies under this due diligence law and making them obligated to comply with this, it is really, really necessary. And the second thing that I wanted to make clear, that whether these obligatory companies, whether these companies' obligation really help people in the down to the chain. Yes, it does. If we wanted to example, the living example can be the Bangladesh Fire and Building Safety Agreement. And that is even not an agreement that state has been made. It's an agreement, legally binding agreement that close to 200 companies had made with a commitment that the factory will be safer for workers in Bangladesh. There will be no more Rana Plaza. So last 8 years, there was a factory accident, but our workers did not die in hundreds that they used to be in Rana Plaza era. So it was just a legal obligation that 20 brands were designed. Just think about if a country or a state just bring that legal obligation for their companies, it will not only save workers in that down to the chain, it will be save everyone in the supply chain, that is store workers to a workers who are producing good for them.
Okay, thank you. Karen.
Yes, thank you. I would just add to this discussion around environment that, excuse me, the use of the term environment in this context also includes climate. So we speak broadly about the human right to a healthy environment, to a sustainable environment, and included in that is climate. We know that we're facing a global climate emergency, and that the due diligence requirements on companies, the duty to prevent harms, that in that is included the climate piece, that the duty to prevent harms would involve adverse harms, adverse climate impacts as well.
Okay. Thank you very much. Evelyne?
Oui, j'ajouterais seulement, Pascal André aussi, merci de ta question sur l'environnement puis de clarifier ce mot-là. C'est que je crois qu'il n'y a pas de meilleur protecteur de l'environnement que nos paysans dans les pays du Sud ou dans les pays pauvres, tout comme nos peuples autochtones ici au Canada. Alors, de protéger les droits humains de ces peuples autochtones à travers le monde va certainement avoir un grand effet sur la protection de l'environnement en même temps. Alors, on y travaille aux deux, mais je crois que c'est très important que le mot environnement soit inscrit dans la loi parce qu'il y a des particularités aussi à protéger l'environnement.
Okay, thank you. I see no other questions, so I'll hand it back over to Evelyne Dwyer.
If any of the panelists are wanting to say a last comment before we wrap up, you can put up your hand or signal that to me. Okay. So before we wrap up completely, a thank you to all of you for being here today, to the many individuals who provided their time, advice, and expertise in the development and drafting of the model legislation, to the human rights defenders and workers who continue to put their lives at risk while standing up to powerful corporations around the world, and to all of my colleagues who have been working behind the scenes at today's event, Jamie Neen and Deanna Martin from Mining Watch Canada, Emily Norgang from the Canadian Labour Congress, Jean Sims, not quite behind the scenes from Interpares, and Devin Holterman from the CNCA. So thank you very much, everyone. We look forward to engaging with you and moving this legislation forward in Canada in the short term. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.